Welcome to AI Paperslop, the YouTube series where we break down the latest AI and tech papers for you, the engineers and researchers building the future. Today, we are diving straight into a massive paper called Have Data Centers Raised Your Electric Bill? Causal Evidence from the United States by Asa Watton, John Bisline, and Jeffrey Blanford, published in 2026.
Yeah, it's a huge one.
And the core insight here right off the bat is that despite the overwhelming public backlash and the general assumption that power-hungry AI data centers are just spiking local utility bills, the data proves the exact opposite.
Right, which is completely counterintuitive.
Yeah, exactly. Using this really brilliant instrumental variables approach, the authors demonstrate that from 2015 to 2024, data center expansion actually lowered average residential electricity rates.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds totally backwards when you first hear it.
Yeah.
But it all really comes down to how the physical power grid is financed, because the electric grid operates on these massive sunk fixed costs.
Right.
So when you introduce durable, massive new demand, like say a hyperscale data center running compute 24/7, it radically increases capital utilization.
Meaning you're spreading those legacy fixed costs over significantly more kilowatt hours.
Exactly, which mechanically drives the average retail prices down for everyone else on that grid.
Which is wild because, if you are building models right now or managing infrastructure, you are probably acutely aware of the sheer energy cost of your compute.
Oh, absolutely.
And the public narrative is just entirely focused on this right now.
Yeah.
Like, imagine a massive multi-billion-dollar AI data center moves into your county. Your first thought is probably, well, great, there goes the neighborhood grid, and here comes a massive utility bill.
Yeah, people are completely convinced that hyperscalers are just, moving in, sucking up the local power, and sticking everyday residents with the tap.
And the hostility is highly measurable, right?
Oh, it really is. If you look at the polling data they cite in the research, it's about 70% of Americans actively oppose having a data center sited near their communities.
70%. That's huge.
Yeah. And we are seeing municipalities across the country enact these strict construction moratoriums. Back in March 2026, the White House even issued a ratepayer protection pledge targeting the major tech companies.
Right, basically forcing them to promise they wouldn't bankrupt the local grids.
Precisely. And panic really stems from the sheer scale of the expansion. Data centers consumed roughly 4.5% of all U.S. electricity in 2024.
Which is double the consumption from just 5 years prior.
Right, and projections suggest that as these large language models scale up, that number could hit anywhere from 9 to 17% by 2030.
Wow. So, I understand the panic. The numbers are staggering. But the descriptive data mapped out in this paper tells a completely different story.
It really does.
Let's contrast two states here, California and Virginia. Because California had relatively low data center growth over the study period compared to its overall sectoral demand. Yet they saw average residential electricity prices increase by nearly 40%. Meanwhile, Virginia is just the undisputed heavyweight champion of U.S. data centers. They consume over 20% of Virginia's total electricity. Yet the rate increases there were perfectly in line with the national average.
Yeah, they didn't see any anomalous spike at all.
Exactly. So it sets up this fascinating paradox between the public sentiment and the baseline data.
Well, and to be fair, California's price spikes were largely driven by the massive capital costs of hardening their grid against wildfires.
Oh, sure.
Whereas Virginia absorbed this massive load increase without punishing ratepayers. But we have to be incredibly careful not to mistake that descriptive state-level data for a pure causal relationship.
Right, and I actually want to push back on the raw data here a bit because if I am playing devil's advocate, Virginia looking fine on paper could just be an illusion.
Oh, so?
Well, if I am a profit-maximizing tech company,
Right.
and I'm deploying a multi-billion-dollar GPU cluster, I am modeling my operating expenses meticulously.
Oh, definitely. Down to the cent.
So I am deliberately going to site my data center in a jurisdiction where I project power will be cheap and abundant anyway. And that dynamic alone creates omitted variable bias.
Exactly.
Like a standard ordinary least squares regression would show a negative correlation between data center growth and power prices, but it wouldn't mean the data center caused the price drop.
Yeah.
It just means the developers are exceptionally good at forecasting cheap power.
That is the exact endogeneity problem the authors identify. And it's why standard regressions just fail completely here. The selection into these states is highly endogenous.
Right. Tech companies aren't just throwing darts at a map.
No, not at all. But it is not just a negative bias we have to worry about. There is a competing upward bias to consider as well, which is driven by what the utility industry calls speed to power.
I've heard that phrase thrown around. Speed to power essentially means how fast a developer can physically get their facility interconnected to the grid, right?
Precisely. The interconnection queue is currently the single biggest bottleneck for new data center capacity.
Because it takes years to get approved.
Exactly. So states or utility companies capable of clearing those interconnection queues rapidly usually have more expensive, highly capitalized grids with a lot of excess capacity built in.
I see where this is going.
Right. If developers prioritize speed to market over cheap baseline power,
Which they absolutely do in an AI arms race.
they absolutely do, then they might systematically locate in jurisdictions with higher prices.
Which completely muddies the water.
Mm-hmm.
So OLS is useless here because you have these competing biases happening simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
You've got price seeking driving a negative bias and speed seeking driving a positive bias.
Exactly. And so to isolate the actual causal impact, we need a clean mathematical wedge.
Which brings us to the methodology. And honestly, this is easily my favorite part of the entire paper.
It's so clever.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
When your standard correlations are tainted by endogeneity, you need an instrumental variable. You need to find a proxy variable that strongly dictates where data centers are built, but has absolutely zero direct relationship to modern electricity prices.
Except through its influence on where those servers actually go.
Right. And for those listening, try to guess what the researchers used to predict where modern AI data centers are located. They used the total length of the original 1947 Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways Plan within each state.
It is brilliant. It's like finding a historical time capsule.
It is, because Eisenhower certainly wasn't thinking about training language models in 1947. So we have this clean, accidental experiment. We can look at what happens when something completely arbitrary dictates location, totally divorced from modern grid politics.
And the relevance pathway here is striking when you actually look at the maps they provide in the paper.
Yeah. How does a highway from the 40s connect to a GPU cluster today?
Well, laying terrestrial fiber optic cable is astronomically expensive. And the highest cost isn't the cable itself, it is the physical labor of digging the trenches.
And the legal nightmare of securing continuous rights of way across private land.
Exactly, the zoning and the lawyers. But the 1947 highway system had already secured massive, contiguous public rights of way across the entire country.
Oh, wow.
So in the 1990s and 2000s, telecom companies simply buried their high-capacity, long-haul fiber networks directly alongside the asphalt of the interstates.
That is so smart. And high-capacity fiber strongly predicts where you build a hyperscale data center because you need massive bandwidth to move data between clusters.
Right. So the highway predicts the fiber and the fiber predicts the data center.
Okay, I am tracking the relevance perfectly. But the second requirement for a valid instrument is the exclusion restriction.
Right. Yes. The tricky part.
How do they guarantee that a massive interstate highway system doesn't impact modern electricity prices through other channels? Because highways obviously drive population centers, suburban sprawl, industrial growth.
All of which heavily affect power demand and infrastructure costs.
Right. So how do they solve that?
That is the biggest hurdle for any historical instrument. To satisfy that exclusion restriction, the authors conditioned their statistical model on state population and state GDP.
Ah, right.
By strictly controlling for those macroeconomic and demographic factors, they effectively filter out the economic footprint of the highways.
So by stripping out the population density and the economic output from the data, the only remaining signal, like the only channel through which a 1947 highway plan mathematically affects a 2024 utility bill, is that fiber optic layout driving data center placement.
That is the mechanism. It allows them to isolate a purely exogenous source of variation. And the econometric tests they run to verify this are super rigorous.
What kind of tests?
They utilize an Anderson-Rubin test to analyze the results. Researchers use this specific test because it remains robust even if the instrumental variable is weak.
Just to ground that for a second for the listeners, normally if an instrument is weak, meaning the 1947 highway only loosely predicts where a tech giant builds today,
your confidence intervals explode.
Right. Your standard errors get so massive that the data is essentially useless for proving causality.
That is the traditional risk in econometrics. Weak instruments inflate variance and just destroy confidence intervals. But the Anderson-Rubin test constructs confidence intervals that maintain their correct coverage probabilities regardless of the strength of the instrument.
Okay, that's incredibly robust.
Yeah. And in this case, with an F statistic of 7.8, The results remain statistically significant at the 0.1% level. It decisively and mathematically rejects the hypothesis that data centers increase residential rates.
So if the exclusion restriction holds, what is the actual damage, or I guess the actual savings, when they run the final model?
The Ivy estimate demonstrates that for every 10% increase in a state's data center capacity, average residential retail prices fell by approximately 0.4%.
Let's put that in tangible terms. From 2019 to 2024, the average person lived in a state where data center capacity grew by roughly 160%. So if we apply that causal model, that massive growth mechanically lowered their electricity rates by 6% compared to the counterfactual reality where those data centers were never built.
The math is robust, but, understanding the econometrics is really only half the battle here. We have to map this onto the physical and economic realities of the power grid.
And this is where I am struggling with the physics a bit, because if I turn on a gigawatt server farm, I'm pulling a massive amount of physical load off the grid.
Huge amounts.
So how does adding immense physical strain to a system make it cheaper to operate? On the surface, this feels like a fundamental violation of the law of supply and demand. If demand for silicon goes up, the price of chips goes up. Why does electricity behave differently?
Because the power sector prices its product in a way that is completely fundamentally different from a standard commodity market. Electricity retail prices are not primarily driven by short-run marginal costs.
Let's unpack that. By short-run marginal costs, you mean like the fuel cost of spinning up a more expensive natural gas peaker plant on a hot July afternoon when everyone comes home and turns their air conditioning on.
Exactly. Those variable short-run costs exist, and utilities do pass them through to consumers. But your monthly utility bill is overwhelmingly a mechanism to recover average costs.
Average costs of what?
It has to pay down the massive sunk fixed capital of the entire generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure.
Okay, let me try an analogy here to see if I'm mapping this correctly. Think of the grid like a city subway system. The transmission towers and substations are like the underground tunnels.
Good analogy.
Running one extra train during rush hour requires a bit more electricity, and that is your marginal cost.
Sure.
But the billion-dollar tunnels, they're already dug.
Right. The massive debt on those tunnels is a fixed cost.
Exactly. So if an AI data center acts like a massive, permanent influx of new daily riders, the system uses slightly more power overall. But the fixed cost of the tunnel is now spread across a vastly larger number of tickets.
Yes.
The average cost per rider drops because you are dividing that giant capital expenditure by a much larger denominator.
That captures the dynamic flawlessly. Data centers run at incredibly high capacity factors, meaning they draw a steady, massive baseline of power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
They don't just peak in the evening like residential users.
No, they don't. And this flat load profile is an absolute dream for utility operators. And the authors actually validate this analogy using descriptive evidence from FERC Form 1 utility data.
What exactly is FERC Form 1?
It is essentially the financial Bible for the U.S. power sector. Every major utility is required by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to submit these incredibly detailed annual reports.
Breaking down their capital expenditures, operation, and maintenance costs.
Exactly. And the authors analyze this data using a log-log specification to model the elasticity of costs with respect to demand.
And what did that reveal about the economies of scale?
They found that as sectoral demand increases, the cost per unit of electricity delivered drops systematically across generation, transmission, and distribution.
Wow.
The relationship is distinctly concave. It is the mathematical signature of economies of scale playing out in the physical infrastructure.
But wait, a listener might be thinking, aren't the tech giants just negotiating secret sweetheart power purchase agreements at wholesale industrial rates and leaving residential customers to subsidize the grid?
Oh, that is a massive fear right now.
Right. People assume that because tech companies have massive lobbying power, they secure cheap electricity, and the utility quietly shifts the financial burden onto households to make up the margin.
It is a highly rational fear, honestly, and the paper attacks that cross-subsidization concern directly.
What did they find?
They examine cross-class rate effects to see if industrial demand shifts the cost burden onto households. And the data proves the exact opposite. They found a complete lack of systematic cost shifting. Yeah, in fact, residential rates fell more than commercial and industrial rates did in response to data center growth.
That is wild. The everyday consumer actually reap a larger efficiency gain than the corporations driving the demand.
Because that new baseline load from data centers increased the overall efficiency of the system, and those savings trickled down through the complex regulatory rate-making process to predominantly benefit everyday households.
So the fixed costs of the distribution networks that deliver power to residential neighborhoods were subsidized by the massive revenues generated from the industrial load.
Exactly.
This paints an incredibly optimistic picture. It almost makes data centers sound like a public utility that we should be begging for.
Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Right. Before we declare AI a miracle cure for our power bills, we have to look closely at the caveats, because the researchers are very explicit about the strict conditions required for this economic model to actually work.
Very strict conditions. The entire premise of spreading fixed costs to lower average prices relies on what energy economists call the build margin.
The build margin.
Yeah. Spreading fixed costs only lowers prices if the grid currently has slack, meaning excess capacity, or if the incremental cost of building new generation is cheaper than the embedded legacy costs of the older power plants on the grid.
Which, to be fair, has generally been true over the last decade, right? Secular technology declines mean wind, solar, and battery storage have become phenomenally cheaper to build.
Right. Adding new, cheap solar lowers the average cost of the whole grid.
But what happens when the grid has zero slack and utilities are forced to build expensive new infrastructure under our current highly constrained macroeconomic conditions?
That is the ultimate bottleneck, and where the optimistic model threatens to break down entirely.
Because things are not cheap to build right now.
Not at all. The authors document severe supply constraints currently choking the U.S. electric sector. We are seeing up to 7-year backlogs on orders for new natural gas turbines, which is drastically inflating their purchase price.
And it's not just generation either. The transmission side is a mess.
Oh, absolute systemic supply chain nightmares. It's severely limiting the availability of high-voltage transformers. The industry is facing a severe shortage of grain-oriented electrical steel, which is the specialized material required to build transformer cores.
Yeah, and you add in high tariffs on Chinese photovoltaic arrays driving up the domestic cost of solar.
And federal approvals for new transmission lines bogged down in years of litigation.
And you have a perfect storm for cost inflation.
Exactly.
So let's play this out. If a local utility is forced to rapidly expand its capacity, specifically to accommodate a 500 megawatt AI cluster, and they have to purchase inflated backlogged equipment to do it, the math flips entirely.
The math completely flips. If the marginal cost of building that new capacity exceeds the average cost of the existing system, average prices for everyone on that grid will rise.
Which means state regulators have to step in. They either have to delay interconnecting these facilities or implement targeted rate structures where the hyperscaler pays directly for that inflated incremental grid expansion.
Right, rather than socializing those new costs across all local ratepayers.
And regulators are increasingly aware of this, which leads into the critical issue of stranded asset risk.
This is a huge one.
This is something anyone building an AI needs to deeply consider. Everything we've discussed assumes this massive compute demand is highly durable. But what happens if the underlying models become vastly more computationally efficient?
Or what if the AI investment bubble pops?
Right.
It presents a massive financial liability for the grid. Imagine a utility operator building billions of dollars in new generation and transmission, specifically based on today's AI growth projections.
And if 5 years from now, algorithmic efficiency drastically reduces power consumption.
Or that demand evaporates entirely. Those physical assets are stranded, the capital was spent, but the kilowatt hours aren't there to divide the debt by.
And in that scenario, everyday ratepayers are left holding the bag. They are essentially forced to pay the mortgage on an empty power plant.
Which perfectly explains the recent policy shifts in states like Kansas and Michigan. They are demanding minimum bills or stringent long-term contracts from new data centers before granting construction permits.
They are essentially telling the developers, look, we will upgrade the grid for your cluster, but you are legally obligated to pay off that infrastructure over the next 20 years, even if your AI startup folds.
It is a necessary financial hedge to protect the public from the volatility of the tech sector.
Absolutely. Now, there is one other major concern I want to unpack before we wrap, which is the natural gas myth.
Ah, yes.
Even if electricity rates go down, there is this pervasive fear that data centers are pulling so much power that they're forcing the grid to burn significantly more natural gas, which in turn spikes the commodity price of natural gas for people heating their homes in the winter.
The authors actually ran a back-of-the-envelope calculation on this to test the validity of the fear, and it turns out data centers only account for about 2% of total U.S. natural gas consumption through the electricity they require.
But, 2% of the massive U.S. supply sounds like it could easily move the needle on local prices.
It would if the U.S. market were an isolated, closed system. But the U.S. is a massive net exporter of natural gas via our LNG terminals.
Right.
So because we export it globally, our domestic prices are deeply co-integrated with massive global energy markets.
So we need to look at causality here.
Yeah.
Because the U.S. exports natural gas, the market operates like an ocean. Tossing the data center demand into that market is like tossing a pebble into the sea.
Exactly.
The 2% is diluted by the immense global volume, meaning the actual price ripples never reach your winter heating bill.
The global market absorbs the localized demand shock entirely. The price effect is negligible.
So if we synthesize everything, from the 1947 highways to the FERC data and the supply constraints, what is the broader implication for the people listening to this deep dive right now?
The implications extend far beyond the tech sector and AI. This paper is a highly optimistic signal for the broader electrification movement.
Because as a society, we are attempting a massive transition from fossil fuels to heat pumps and electric vehicles.
Exactly. And that transition requires a staggering amount of new electricity demand.
Which historically terrifies people, because the default assumption is always that more demand equals higher prices.
But this rigorous causal data proves otherwise. If the grid can handle the massive, concentrated, always-on load of hyperscale data centers without raising average prices.
And actually lowering them through capital utilization.
Right. It bodes incredibly well for the economics of adopting EVs and heat pumps en masse.
The caveat being that we have to intelligently manage the unique load shapes of those technologies.
And we absolutely have to solve the supply chain bottlenecks so we aren't paying massive premiums to build the new infrastructure.
That is the challenge. But the foundational economic physics remain sound. Scaling the system can actually make it cheaper for everyone.
It really can.
It completely flips the public narrative. Which leaves you with something to mull over as we close out this session. We spend so much political energy fighting the construction of new data centers in our communities out of fear that they will drain our resources and spike our bills.
Right.
But if this paper is right and durable, massive demand is actually the key to unlocking the economies of scale needed to fund modern grid infrastructure. Should local municipalities actually be bidding to bring AI data centers to their backyards to covertly subsidize the cost of their own clean energy transitions?
That is a fascinating question.
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on AI Paper Slop. We'll catch you on the next one. Keep building.